Hello guys, today I got a Zeiss Distagon 35mm f1.4 for the Contax Yashica mount, which I will be servicing. It has extremely stiff focus, tons of dust, as well as some haze under the front element. On top of that, both the mount and the front barrel are shaky. In order to fix all these problems, I will have to disassemble this lens completely, clean up, and apply new grease to the focusing helicoid and clean some of the optics. While at it, I will also perform some basic maintenance and cleaning. Here are a few facts about this lens. If you're not interested, you can of course skip to this servicing part. In 1966, Zeiss presented the Contorex 35mm f2 Distagon lens, an exceptional performer even by today's standards. At that time, even a 35mm f2 was regarded a very fast lens for the focal length. Leica already had a 35mm f1.4 Summilux M lens for the rangefinder series, but of course SLR lenses had different limitations and design challenges. Nikon managed to overcome those limitations and has presented a 35mm f1.4 lens in 1970. 1 year later, Zeiss will present their own version, the Distagon 35mm f1.4 HFT lens for the Rollei QBM mount, taking advantage of some of the most advanced lens design techniques of the era. The lens features a floating element design which moves independently from the rest of the lens and allows for better aberration control and sharpness throughout the focusing range. Although not advertised like Canon did with their spherical FT lenses, these lenses also feature an aspherical element, quite an achievement for such a complex lens of the early 70s. If you consider that this lens was presented at the same time that Canon was just starting to manufacture a small amount of the very first version of their 55mm f1.2 aspherical, you can understand that these companies were under fierce technological competition, trying to impress with their new designs. Zeiss was like, okay, so Nikon made a 35mm f1.4 lens, and Canon made an aspherical 55mm lens, so here's our lens, a 35mm f1.4 with an aspherical and floating element, the Zeiss robust manufacturing quality, and technically the best coating of its time. Of course, unlike its competitors in the SLR market, Zeiss had a very advanced and industry-standard Cine lenses line at the time that all of these technologies were already applied on. The SLR market, though, was a more massively produced commercial product, and companies at those times were competing for prestige. When a few years later, in 1975, Zeiss teamed up with Yashica to present their own SLR system, the 35mm f1.4 was of course in the starting lineup and the most impressive lens of the series. Zeiss will keep making the same lens up to 1997. Initially, the production of this lens took place in West Germany, with all the copies up to 1985 being the AE version, plus a small run of the MM version up to 1987. In 1991, they moved the production of this lens to Japan, where the common MMJ version of this lens was produced. All copies are generally optically identical and share the same barrel and mechanics, except the aperture mechanism between AE and MM versions. Earlier copies made up to the mid-80s do seem to have a slight advantage on wide-open performance, something that is also observed on the other Contax super speeds, the 51.4 and 85.1.4, but not on the slower versions. In 2010, Zeiss will bring a new version of this lens back as the now classic Distagon 35mm f1.4 for the Canon and Nikon mounts. The lens features a recalculated version of the original optical design with the addition of an extra element in the back group and the creation of a new doublet in the middle section. Those sections resulted in reduced aberrations and much sharper performance wide open. The more recent Milvus version of this lens is a much more advanced design which surpasses both previous versions in performance while maintaining the beautiful Zeiss signature look and characteristics. The common problems that come up with this lens are the very stiff focus because of the hardened grease when the lens hasn't been serviced for a while, some haze, usually under the front element, and also separation of the doublet, which seemed to be much more common in the late copies made after the mid-80s. Incorrect calibration of the floating group in the front is also common, usually because somebody who doesn't understand how this lens works attempted to open it up. The front element is also flat, and just like the Contax 28mm f2, it's quite easy for its coating to start wearing off with thin scratches if improperly cleaned. The same element is also painted around, so if it starts losing its paint for some reason, it might appear to have some inner dots or lines, what some people call cynaridis. In general, I would buy this lens blindly if it's one with a serial under around 70, which are mainly AE and MMG versions. I would definitely want to inspect under a very strong flashlight and test on a camera against the flashlight any copy with a serial above 72, because the likelihood for separation or strong haze is much higher. You can see the diagram of this lens with one cemented doublet on the back. The front group is part of what's called a floating element and is taken out together in one assembly. The 4 back elements can be taken out from the back side, leaving the 2 elements in the middle that sit right in front of the iris, and they can be removed independently from the front side. The elements around the iris are always the more susceptible to haze and dust, of course. The back element in this lens is of a spherical design. Here's a little story from when I got my first 35mm f1.4 Contax lens many years ago. When I started making my first Contax set and affected by biased and bad information online, I was obsessed with finding the version of this lens. I was such a complete snob back then and thought that the AE version of the Contaxes were some really terrible old lenses, while the versions were so much better. I would see a Contax lens without the green paint on the last aperture and I would immediately dismiss it as some kind of second-class lens. Because that's what the information online was telling me. That I should hate the aperture shape of the AE lenses because it's so bad and what would the client say. I have also convinced myself that because the lenses were made more recently, they were made better and they could be found in better condition. Also, people were talking about serial matching and coating differences, so I wanted to make sure my set is all matched. All of these, of course, are mostly internet myths, but there are forums and blogs and groups and people all talking about those versions. There must be something so great about them, right? I can't be an outsider. Those were my feelings back then anyways. I was waiting for months, but nothing reasonable would come up. So I have decided to get the terrible AE version temporarily to complete my set. I ordered one from Japanese eBay and paid the extra import fees, which compared to current prices, it was a total steal. When arrived, the lens was so solid and clean, with smooth focus, with wonderful optics and great performance. I fell in love with it and it quickly became my favorite Contax lens. Back then I didn't have the right screwdriver, neither I knew the proper techniques, so I have stripped the mount screws and I couldn't declick it or install an F-mount. I also couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the great version and that it somehow wasn't matched with the rest of my set, which all were lenses. I felt that the version would be even better, so I kept hunting for it. Till one day I finally found an copy for sale locally. The copy I found was generally clean, but nowhere near the really mint condition of my AE copy. Most importantly, its focusing ring was annoyingly stiff. I really couldn't work with it on a project like that. I did a little comparison back then and I found out that my AE copy was actually just a little sharper as well, but I blamed it on the dust that my copy had. I sold my AE copy a little cheaper because of the strip screws and I just moved on. A couple of months later, coming back from a shot, I was so annoyed with the stiff focusing situation of my copy. A few months before that, I had a relative success with relubricating the focus of Contax 28mm f2.8. My first ever lens to open up. Back then, the only quotes I had about servicing lenses was in many hundreds of dollars and I thought that's the going price in general. Also, I was worried about sending my lens abroad and dealing with new import fees. So, I decided to open up my 35mm f1.4 lens as well, thinking it can't possibly be that hard, right? I was really stressed and shaking working on the lens. I had no idea what I was doing, there were no guides or instructions online, my tools and techniques were quite primitive, and I didn't have any experience except that one simple 28mm f2.8 lens. Everything of course went wrong. The front ring got stuck on its threads, the front element was stuck and I couldn't get it back in or out. I couldn't handle elements properly because I was missing tools I didn't even know their existence, and I had the lens open at my desk for weeks trying to figure out solutions. I didn't make the correct markings on the helicoid and it took me ages to find out how I can get it back together. I couldn't get the elements back to a clean state and they would always have dust and smudges no matter what I used. I really suffered and I was very sad because I really saved up to get that lens. Every day I would attempt something new, fail, and then think about it and come back next time. I still had the brains to handle the elements very carefully and thankfully there was no damage. With my current experience, I now know that I was very lucky about it back then. Eventually, I had success in putting the lens back mechanically. Or so I thought. I've put all the elements back, even though they were not that clean. When I tested the lens, the image was terrible in a very obvious way. I've spent another week or two being very sad, considering getting another copy and selling that one very cheaply, but I decided to open up the lens once again. Upon careful inspection with a flashlight, I found out that all those cleaning solutions and chemicals I've been using trying to clean the elements have really smudged up the elements so much and they were the cause of this fuzziness. I've seen that people online actually just washed the elements with water and soap, so being very desperate, I gave that a try as well. To my disbelief, the elements cleared up from all that chemical dirt and I could get a much better image after assembly. There was still something a bit bothering, which was that the edges were a bit blurry. I disassembled the lens again, cleaned everything, and I've put it back, and this time it was much better. What I didn't know, of course, which I know now, was that it was only better because I've randomly put the floating group back in a more correct position than before. Eventually, I found another copy that had smooth focus already and I just got it. I sold the other copy for an honest cheaper price, explaining that I have serviced it and although it works fine and the optics are good, I just have lost trust in the lens. Just before I sent it out though, I had the idea to give it yet another cleanup just to make sure the buyer would be satisfied. When the guy tested the lens, immediately complained about the infinity focus being off as well as the very blurry edges. I couldn't understand it. I sent him pictures and videos that I've took with this lens just a few weeks before. I even have cleaned the elements even better. Although I did have my suspicions by this point, I really didn't know how to exactly deal with this and I had such a stressful experience with that lens that I didn't want to see it ever again. So I agreed to pay any fees required to service and calibrate the lens at a professional technician. The guy delayed it a bit, then sent the lens to another country and a trusted technician he knew of. The buyer got another 35 1.4 and the lens stayed there for years and it was not even touched actually. Meanwhile, I was getting better and better with servicing and I had an experience with a 28mm f2 lens which made me understand the floating group system in detail. So I've told the guy that if his technician didn't have the time or can't fix it, I would be very happy to take care of it with no charges. Probably another year later, he managed to get his lens back from the technician and has sent it to me, where I finally gave it the love and proper attention that it deserved. The buyer was really happy with how the lens was performing this time around. While all this experience did allow me to learn a lot of things, knowing the stress I went through and the time, money and energy I've spent trying to deal with that lens by my own, I would have paid any amount of money for somebody who knew what they were doing to service that lens. These days, of course, I can probably open up and assemble back this lens in a few minutes if there was such a weird competition for some reason, but it unfortunately did take a lot of stress, money, time and some pretty nasty damages to reach this level. This lens is definitely not something that you can afford doing mistakes and experimenting with. But enough with the stories, let's get to the bends. So, I received this 35mm f1.4 lens for a completely servicing job. The first thing I did, of course, was to test the lens and compare it with other copies of this lens that I have serviced before, as well as my own. I determined that the performance was very good and comparable to other copies of this lens at all apertures and conditions. Its owner found this lens at a very good price, but it does come with a couple of problems, and that's why a servicing was necessary. The first thing was a very stiff focus. In fact, it was one of the stiffest I've ever seen, and it was really hard to turn, definitely not something usable even for photography. The harder the focus, the more the strain on the lens mount and the camera mount itself, or any adapter you have connecting the lens to the camera. This is why servicing is highly recommended for lenses with stiff focus. Another problem was that the whole mount was quite loose and shaky, which kind of proves the point I just made. Somebody was probably trying to use this lens while it had such a stiff focus and ended up stressing the mount of the lens. The front hood was shaking as well, perhaps because somebody was trying to turn the focusing while holding the front part. In either case, I wasn't sure at this point if everything is connected with a stiff focus, and I started thinking that maybe this lens was dropped before and the focusing helicoils might even be distorted. The good news was that the iris was working well and there were no obvious scratches or marks on the front and back elements. Internally, the lens has a lot of dust, as well as the typical for the 35mm 1.4 little haze under the front element. Obviously, if you just see through the lens without the strong flashlight, everything looks so perfect, like brand new. The flashlight I'm using is extremely intense, so I can see everything and therefore know the true condition of the lens, so I can make sure to test the effect of anything unexpected, such as this little haze here in the front element. Since I have already tested the lens and I knew it was flaring as good as any other copy, I wasn't very worried about this little haze. I would give it a good clean anyways in case it was still in wet form and thus removable. I checked again with a different kind of flashlight, which while it isn't that intense, I can really see the dust inside, which was quite a lot on the usual suspects, which are the elements in front and back of the iris. The markings were also much yellowed and in bad shape, so they would definitely benefit from a repainting job, which I will do later when the lens is completely disassembled. This lens is very similar in mechanical design to the 28mm f2 Distagon lens, and the steps for disassembly and assembly are pretty much the same. The only real difference is that in this lens there are two middle elements that sit in front of the iris. I could see a few marks on the label ring, showing that somebody was actually trying to open this lens with some kind of makeshift tool like tape. At this point I hope they never succeeded or they got scared and didn't go further into the lens. I use the right size of the lens rubber tool and I go slowly with equal pressure all around, because this kind of rings can sometimes be screwed unevenly and cause damage on the threads and a lot of trouble to take off. Luckily, this one came out very nicely. The front is of course the famous and well advertised floating group, which makes this lens have very good performance throughout the focusing range. While the back group of the lens focuses by moving back and forth, the front group actually rotates. I measure the distance that the front group sits while the lens is at infinity. This is so I have a rough estimate of where to put the group back. I don't have to be very accurate or concerned about it, since I will calibrate the lens on a chart later anyways, but I do like to take measurements just in case I'm ever in doubt. I take out the 3 screws that secure the front group so I can unscrew it. It feels very stiff, which is not normal, as this group should turn very smoothly on its own secondary helicoid. I take out the element and the ring that was sitting under it. I give it a quick check to confirm that there isn't much dust in this group. I will take care of this later when I will attempt to clean the haze anyways. Then I proceed to the 3 screws that secure the front barrel of the lens, and I found out that the screws were very loose, which explains the shaking of the barrel. This means that the thread lock that was put on these screws from the factory was broken, either by some impact, micro vibrations, somebody putting so much force to screw or unscrew a filter, or very likely somebody just opened this lens for servicing and they thought it's okay to not put back any thread lock. The point is that without any thread lock, the screws will eventually start getting loose and cause this shaky barrel problem. I tested the focusing at this point and found out that although quite stiff, it was much easier to turn, a very good sign that this lens doesn't have any permanent damage on the primary helicoid, and I just had to deal with the very hardened grease. I like to take it slowly at this point and observe every detail in the lens. I found out that it was quite dirty with dust and grease on the mechanics. I'm careful not to turn the lens around completely since the assembly with the back group and the iris is held only by a tiny screw, which is there to set the orientation of the iris and not really to hold it into the barrel. I carefully take the assembly out and I take my time to inspect the iris a bit, and I find it's quite dirty all around. Next, I will take off the mount of the lens. I found out that one of the screws was quite stripped and also some of the screws were loose, the probable reason why the mount was shaking. I documented all this so I can let the owner know about it in case something goes wrong, like I can take the screws off. Thankfully, that was not the case and all the screws came out alright. Everything seems good under the mount and I took the iris ring off. Now it's time to take the focusing ring off. I make sure the focusing is set at infinity and stays there while I'm unscrewing the focusing ring. I make a mark at where the tightening ring was located for easier assembly later. I see some marks from a previous servicing, but I'm making my own anyways, marking the position that the helicoids were at when the lens is focused at infinity. First on the outer helicoid and then on the inner helicoid. Then I'm measuring the distance from the back barrel to both the inner and outer helicoids. This is not necessary, but a good practice just in case. Next, I take off the helicoid keys so the helicoid can be decoupled. Each key is a little different, so I make sure to remember what goes where. Now I can decouple the helicoids. I mark the exact point that the inner helicoid decoupled so I can put it back in the same way. This is very important as the helicoid has many entry points and only one is the correct that leads to the proper position where the keys fit in properly and the focusing system works as designed. At this point, I started feeling how this thick grease has hardened a lot and affected the feel of the lens. I unscrew the outer helicoid and make sure to mark where it decouples as well. I've put the helicoids into lighter fluid outside of the room for a while and I started cleaning the back part of the helicoid. I take a lot of thick grease off and I continue by cleaning very thoroughly with any means I have in order to guarantee a good focusing feel. I then moved to cleaning up the barrel. This lens was really dirty. I brought back the cleaned helicoids and I started testing how the focusing feels with the focusing system assembled, so I can see if there was any actual damage on the helicoids because I was still a little suspicious at this point. I figured out the focusing was good enough, but there were some really hard points on the helicoid which I had to clean using a metallic dart. Then I resumed cleaning up the rest of the helicoids and I started applying some light grease. During this process I assembled and disassembled the focusing system many times, cleaning up and applying new grease, testing with the focusing attached, till I make sure the focusing feels right. In this particular lens, I wanted to make sure the focusing is fine even when the front group is added on the secondary helicoid. There was a lot of that thick grease on the front group which is not really compatible with this mechanism, as the secondary helicoid should have very light grease just to barely move in and out smoothly. Then thicker grease can be applied to the primary helicoid in order to achieve the desired focusing feel. I think this, along with the fact that the main helicoid wasn't probably cleaned during the previous servicing, were the main reasons that this lens focusing was so hard. I take my time to clean all this very well and thoroughly. Then I assemble the front group temporarily to test the focusing feel of the complete system. After confirming the feel is generally good when the front group is calibrated at the correct position, I disassemble the lens again in order to resume the cleaning. This includes repainting all the white markings on the lens barrel, the focusing ring and the iris ring that have yellowed with time and didn't whiten enough during cleaning. I use enamel paint and I wipe off the excess carefully with some alcohol. While the lens is a little beaten up, the result is still quite satisfying and definitely much better than before. Now it's time to work on the elements. To me, this is the most time-consuming and demanding work, and I only proceed with cleaning elements when absolutely necessary and not just to remove a couple of dusts. That is because if you're not at a factory level clean room, a lot more dust can actually sneak in during cleaning and it can take a lot of time and effort to get them back to a satisfying condition. Of course, somebody can just clean the elements without a backlight and call it a day, because then the elements would look really clean at first look. There are a lot of videos on YouTube like that where you see people washing and cleaning the elements, often in some crude ways, and then saying it looks so clean. When observed with a backlight though, they will be full of cleaning smudges and dust introduced by the cleaning. I have seen many such lenses that were sent to me for servicing where you can clearly see all the smudges, streaks and dust that a previous servicing left. If this is at many elements, when the lens is assembled back, it can look really terrible, almost like a fog that actually affects performance. So it's very important to take good decisions on what exactly to open up and clean and what the expectations should be, because once an element is touched, even a little, it can never be cleaned at a factory level without a clean room and very good techniques. There are always risks associated when working with optics as well, from scratching an element because the spacer to unlock it is too tight, to making coating marks by cleaning with the wrong materials, or even worse, dropping the element. So if an element looks generally clean and it hasn't been touched since factory, it's always the better choice to leave it alone. It doesn't affect performance anyways. In this case, unfortunately, the lens had more than acceptable dust at some of the elements, mainly the elements located in the front and back of the iris, as that's where dust usually sneaks in during normal usage. I decided to take off the elements from the back side because it's less risky than removing the middle elements that are sitting deep in the barrel in front of the iris. After unscrewing the back retainer ring, I use a lens sucker tool to remove the back element. Turning the lens upside down and letting elements fall off is really a great way to get into accidents and scratches. After the back element is out, there is also a doublet and another element. All these elements form the back group of the lens. I make sure to cover any exposed elements with some caps while I'm working on cleaning the middle element that is behind the iris. After close inspection, I found out that the dust is stuck on the element because of evaporated grease. Given some time and conditions, this evaporated grease can mix with the coatings and turn into a permanent haze that sort of polishing off the element will not be cleanable. Luckily, we're not at this stage yet, and it also means I don't need to wet the element any further. Instead, I'm using a Q-tip to collect the grease and the dust particles stuck on it. I would never do this on a dry element, of course, but in this case the element is wet from the grease. I go very gently and very slowly using many Q-tips, making sure I'm only collecting the grease and I'm not actually rubbing against the element. I'm using some pointed Q-tips as well in order to collect any grease from the edges. The element already looks so much better than before. I'm not worried about some tiny leftover dust. Now it's time for cleaning up the element that is behind the iris. Since I have direct access to this element, I will do a full wash. I put a water drop and I use a Q-tip to very gently bath the element. Then I dry off the water with a Kimtech tissue. This took care most of the dirt and grease, but it wasn't enough to give it a totally clean look. I'm using PEG pads cut in small sizes, put a drop of lighter fluid on top and gently rub, then slide off the PEG pad to avoid creating any streaks. When the element is finally clean, it's time to put it back to the lens body. This is one of those drum roll moments that, if not done correctly, the element will get stuck at an incorrect position, and taking it out can be very tricky and cause permanent damage to the element or the body. The problem is that the metallic body is created with very small tolerance. When the environment is just a little cold, the metal actually shrinks. In order for the element to slide in without risking getting stuck, the metal needs to expand. The way to do that is by heating it. I'm using a hair dryer for that purpose. Hair dryers can make the metal hot enough to expand, but not that hot to damage any of the lens components, including elements and tablets. With the assistance of the lens sucker tool that helps me inserting the element in the correct position and also allows me to gently rotate it, I make sure the element is inserted as smoothly as possible, and if required, I keep heating the metal body. If all done correctly, the element will fit in perfectly. I then clean the top of the element at the position I use the lens sucker tool, and I insert the tablet and the back element on top while cleaning as required. Even this can get stuck at an incorrect position, so I proceed very carefully and patiently and use the heating technique as required. I then get to the assembly of the lens. I make sure the helicoids are set at infinity by using my marks, and after putting the tightening ring at the right position, I screw on the focusing ring. I'm not using any thread lock at this point, as I will still calibrate the lens for infinity later, just in case. This lens has quite a few screws around the focusing ring, and I take my time to make sure all the screws are going in straight, as it can be a little tricky to get the tightening ring bent around the focusing ring. I'm using a toothpick to pull the tightening ring at the correct position. Using anything metallic to do this maybe damage the screw threads, leaving you with a bad focusing feel. Once everything is screwed in, I test the focus and make sure it's even and smooth. When I finally confirm everything is alright, I apply some thread lock onto the helicoid keys screws one at a time. Next, I put the back group and iris assembly and the front barrel on top, this time applying some thread lock not just on the screw but also on the top of the screw as well. I also put the clicking ball and the iris ring back, applying some grease to create a nice clicking feel. I adjust and put some thread lock on the screws on the iris ring, and then I put the mount on top, also applying a little thread lock on each of the screws. Next, I put the front group of the lens. Assembling this floating group correctly is a little tricky and requires an understanding of the mechanical system. In general, I first put the ring, then the elements group inside it, and I screw each of the screws in, but not tightening them completely. Then I carefully insert it into the lens in a very specific way, so while the front group screws in, the ring fits in the focusing key. I measure the distance and make sure the element is at about the right distance, and then I tighten the screws. I don't care about being precise at this point, as I will calibrate this on a chart later. Calibrating floating groups is a very specific process, so perhaps I will make a separate video in the future about it. At this point, I will finally have to deal with the haze under the front element. Using a rubber tool, I can take off the retainer ring of the front group. Again, this is a drum roll moment. The front element is very tightly fit into the metal body, and attempting to remove it can result into it getting stuck at an incorrect position. I have unfortunately seen a few lenses, including a couple of 35 1.4s, that have their element chipped off because somebody didn't have the knowledge and patience, and they just tried to force the element out using some sort of tool. All it takes is a little heat for the metal to expand and the element pops out smoothly. I inspect the element a bit, but at this point I know that I will have to clean it anyways. This element is painted all around, and using some chemicals, especially acetone, will remove the paint, so caution is required. While the element can be repainted, of course, it's very hard to create that thin layer so the element can easily fit back, so it's important to take care. Before I start working on the front element, I clean very carefully a bit of the second element. Due to its curvature and positioning, this is one of the hardest elements ever to clean, and I really don't want to create any dirt on it that I will have to do a full cleaning to remove, as that process can take a lot of work. I start with some water on the back of the front element and I gently wash it with a Q-tip, then I dry it off the excess using a Kimtech tissue. It's very hard to see what is actually going on when the element is by its own, so it needs a lot of patience, trial and error. I'm then using some lighter fluid carefully so I don't touch the paint, attempting to remove the haze and other patterns. I take my time with a clean fiber cloth and Q-tips to finalize the cleaning. When everything is cleaned up, I heat up the metal again so it expands and I carefully slide in the element. I'm satisfied with how everything looks, so I take the lens for an infinity and floating group calibration. Finally, I put some thread lock on the screws of the focusing ring, and when that's dried, I put the focusing rubber back as well. Now, this is a great lens again with clean optics and mechanics, a smooth focusing and iris ring, ready to be used for many years to come and definitely a much better lens than how it arrived. Thank you so much for watching this video. Always remember to not open up vintage lenses without the proper tools, patience and experience. Many of these lenses were made only in a few thousand copies, they will never be made again and you might be damaging one of the last good ones. Always start with cheaper and easily replaceable lenses and slowly build up your experience from there. Never force anything, never put too much power and never use improper tools or chemicals. Lenses servicing can be very stressful and traumatic to some extent if an expensive and rare lens gets permanently damaged. The Contax Distax on 35mm f1.4 has already got real expensive these days, and despite my detailed video, it's still not an easy lens to service because in lens servicing, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. There are still many great technicians out there that can get your lens in perfect shape without all the stress and worries, so make sure to consider all the options. Have a great day and see you next time!